Welcome the Lord's chosen. When the truth starts sounding like classified information, that's when you know you've seen too much. Somewhere between your silence and their surveillance, a file got opened with your name on it. Not because you broke the law, but because you broke their pattern. The feds didn't stumble upon you by accident. They studied you like a glitch in their perfectly coded illusion. Every move you made, every call, every post, recorded, dissected, replayed, not out of justice but curiosity. Because nothing confuses a system more than a person it can't control. It's a strange world where your spiritual awakening gets treated like a national security threat, where your growth triggers government-grade paranoia. They promised your family you'd be gone before court, but here you are, breathing, unbothered, and somehow trending in heaven's database. See the funny part? They actually thought they could schedule your downfall like a meeting, as if destiny could be subpoenaed or miracles could be cross-examined. They underestimated how divine timing doesn't follow legal procedure. You became their mystery report, the one case that makes agents question reality during coffee breaks. How is this one still standing? They whisper, while pretending not to look over their shoulders. Because deep down, even they know, the chosen aren't protected by lawyers. They're protected by laws this world didn't write. So buckle in, because this isn't a story about fear. It's a revelation of exposure. The moment heaven and the feds accidentally tuned into the same frequency and realized they'd both been tracking the same person all along. Number one, the investigation was spiritual before it was federal. Before any agent tapped a phone or followed a signal, something far greater had already marked you for observation. Your life drew attention in two realms, one divine, one governmental. And it started the moment you refused to live on autopilot. You didn't get noticed because of what you did wrong, but because of what you woke up to. When a person starts seeing beyond what they're told, when their intuition becomes louder than their programming, the universe takes note, and so do those who run the systems that profit from people staying asleep. Every file that exists on you in some digital archive is just a human echo of a spiritual record that was opened long before. Heaven knew what was coming. Your growth wasn't random, it was preparation. You were being trained for the kind of awareness that can't be bought, bribed, or broken. And when that kind of clarity hits, it disturbs structures that rely on blind obedience. The feds were never the beginning of your monitoring. They were just the physical manifestation of something ancient, divine observation. They thought they found you through technology, but they were just late to the story. You were already being tracked by destiny, and destiny doesn't need surveillance vans. It watches through alignment, through the way doors open and close, through the timing of events that make no logical sense but unfold with surgical precision. By the time the system labeled you of interest, heaven had already stamped you chosen. This is why their investigation feels off balance. They keep collecting data that doesn't add up, because they're trying to study something that exists outside their jurisdiction. You don't fit their equations, and that frustrates them. To them, you're unpredictable. To heaven, you're unfolding exactly as planned. They're studying evidence while God is revealing purpose. The truth is, the spiritual realm started the investigation not to expose you, but to protect you. The physical one only copied the pattern, without the understanding. They think they're watching a person. They're actually witnessing prophecy in motion. And when the divine starts writing reports, no human agency can close the case. Because how do you arrest something that was never meant to be contained? Number two, their fear wasn't about crime, it was about control. You didn't scare them because you broke rules. You scared them because you stopped needing permission to exist. The system runs smoothly when people stay predictable, when they follow the script, chase approval, and keep their heads down. But you broke formation. You stopped performing for acceptance and started operating from truth. That's when they got nervous. Power doesn't panic when people misbehave. It panics when people wake up. They never needed evidence of wrongdoing. They just needed justification for interference. You became the kind of person they couldn't categorize, and that alone is enough to trigger every defense mechanism in a structure built on control. When you no longer respond to threats, flattery, or manipulation, you become a liability to the narrative. That's what you are, a narrative breaker. The system relies on fear to maintain order, but you started functioning from faith and clarity, and that short-circuited everything. Their fear wasn't that you'd commit a crime, it was that you'd expose the real crime, how power has been manufactured and distributed to keep certain minds quiet. Your independence made you unpredictable. They couldn't tell what you'd do next because you weren't playing by the usual programming. And when someone moves by divine timing instead of social conditioning, control collapses. They had to make you look dangerous because that's how control protects itself, by rewriting the story. They couldn't convince you to stop, so they tried to convince everyone else you were the problem. That's how systems neutralize influence. They isolate, discredit, and overanalyze until people forget why the person was targeted in the first place. But their fear was never personal. It was systemic. You're proof that someone can live free in a world designed to cage the mind. At its core, their fear was recognition. They saw in you what they secretly wished they could be: untamed, unbought, unbothered. You were the reminder that freedom isn't granted, it's reclaimed. That kind of truth can't be managed, monitored, or manipulated. Control can survive rebellion, but it can't survive awakening. And once someone like you stops bowing to the illusion, the entire structure begins to tremble, not because you broke the law, but because you broke the spell. Number 3, your bloodline became the bargaining chip. When systems can't control you directly, they look for what you love. They know the strongest hearts don't fold under pressure, so they aim at the ties that make those hearts human. You became too resistant to fear, too aware to manipulate, too strong to break, so they went after your family. They knew your loyalty was both your strength and your soft spot, and that's where they planned to bargain. They didn't need you to confess or comply, they only needed you to feel conflicted. So they whispered promises to those connected to you, deals that sounded like protection, but were really disguised threats. They told them you'd be gone before court, that it was better to let you go quietly than to fight a losing battle. That's how power moves when it's desperate. It doesn't just intimidate the target, it infects the circle around them. The goal was never to destroy your body, it was to divide your bond. They wanted you to walk into isolation, thinking you'd been abandoned, to break your spirit without lifting a hand. And for a moment, they almost succeeded. Because betrayal from strangers hurts, but doubt from family cuts deeper. They used emotional warfare dressed as concern. They made your name sound like a problem, not a promise. But what they underestimated was that loyalty built on divine purpose doesn't dissolve under fear. You were never fighting your family. You were fighting the version of them the system manipulated. They couldn't see what you saw. They weren't part of the conversation heaven had with you in the dark. Their fear was borrowed, not born. The irony is that by using your bloodline as leverage, they exposed how sacred it really was. They forced you to detach from emotional dependence and walk in spiritual independence. That separation wasn't punishment, it was refinement. It made you see that family isn't always those who share your blood, but those who recognize your battle. So yes, they used your family as a bargaining chip, but they lost the deal. Because the moment you stopped trying to be understood, you became unstoppable. What they thought would break you actually crowned you. You didn't lose your family. You outgrew the version of them fear had created. Number 4, Evidence was never their goal. Elimination was. The system never cared about justice. It cared about survival. The moment you became aware of what was really happening, you became a threat, not because you did something wrong, but because you saw something you weren't supposed to understand. That's when they changed the mission. They stopped searching for evidence and started building a storyline, one that would make your removal look righteous. The files, the reports, the quiet whispers behind closed doors weren't about truth. They were about theater. They needed paperwork that made fear look like authority. Every accusation, every rumor, every conveniently leaked detail was part of an architecture designed to justify your disappearance. It wasn't about law, it was about legitimacy. They wanted the public to see you fall and believe it was necessary. The easiest way to erase a threat is to first convince everyone it deserved to be erased. That's why they didn't need proof. They needed perception. They knew if they could stain your reputation, they wouldn't have to touch your body. They could make people doubt your voice, and the rest would take care of itself. What they didn't expect was how uncooperative truth can be. They could forge reports, edit recordings, and distort timelines, but they couldn't alter the fact that something about your story still felt divine. That's what scared them most, the way your presence kept exposing cracks in their performance. You weren't an enemy to their system. You were a mirror showing them what it had become. And when powerful people see their reflection in someone they can't control, elimination becomes the only solution that makes sense to them. They tried to end you with bureaucracy, but heaven kept interrupting their paperwork. Every delay, every glitch, every failed attempt was divine interference. They wanted you silenced, but your name kept echoing through the corridors they built to contain you. The more they tried to erase you, the more undeniable you became. In the end, they never wanted evidence. They wanted absence. They wanted you gone, forgotten, rewritten. But they miscalculated something crucial. When destiny marks someone, deletion doesn't work. The more they tried to bury you, the more you became proof that some people aren't meant to vanish. They're meant to be witnessed. Number 5, you were the case study of consciousness. They couldn't contain. They didn't just watch you, they studied you. Every word you spoke, every move you made, every shift in your behavior became material for their silent obsession. You weren't under investigation in the traditional sense. You were being analyzed like a phenomenon they couldn't explain. You became the human version of a system error, proof that awareness itself could be contagious. They couldn't figure out how someone who had been through so much still refused to break, still thought independently, still carried light in a world engineered to dim it. So they documented you, hoping to decode the source of your strength. They wanted to understand what happens when a person wakes up fully, when they stop moving through life hypnotized by fear, validation, and routine. You exposed what their control mechanisms were never built to handle, a mind that questions everything and a soul that answers only to truth. You weren't rebelling for attention. You were evolving beyond manipulation. That's what scared them. You became a living glitch in their psychological programming, a variable they couldn't predict, a pattern they couldn't model, and a consciousness they couldn't reverse engineer. Their research wasn't about justice, it was about containment. They wanted to observe how far an awakened individual could go before breaking, what triggered emotional exhaustion, and how to prevent others from following your path. You became their secret blueprint of resistance, a reference point in their reports on uncontrollable subjects. But the irony is, while they studied your resilience, they accidentally absorbed your truth. You can't stare at light for too long without being changed by it. What they didn't realize is that your strength didn't come from rebellion, but from revelation. You weren't trying to fight the system. You were just too awake to belong to it. Every attempt to box you in only proved how limitless you had become. You turned their experiment into exposure, their analysis into evidence that human consciousness can't be caged. They thought they were dissecting a person, but they were actually witnessing a shift. The kind that no report, no theory, no database could explain. You weren't their subject. You were their awakening in disguise. Number 6, the real crime was your awareness. You didn't break a law. You broke a pattern. The only thing you were guilty of was noticing too much. In a world built on distraction, awareness becomes rebellion. They didn't come after you because you were dangerous. They came after you because you were awake. When you started seeing behind the curtain, when you stopped believing the headlines and started reading the motives, you crossed an invisible line. Awareness isn't supposed to be criminal, but in a controlled society, it's treated like contraband. Your clarity disrupted comfort zones that depend on confusion. You saw how lies were dressed as laws, how manipulation was disguised as management, and how silence was rewarded while truth was punished. You realized that most people aren't asleep by accident. They're lulled into comfort by design. That realization alone made you a threat, because systems survive not on order, but on obedience. You stopped giving them that. You stopped nodding along to illusions. You started thinking for yourself, and in their world, independent thought is treason. They couldn't charge you for what you saw, so they looked for ways to twist it. They started calling your discernment defiance, your confidence arrogance, and your peace instability. That's how power protects itself, by pathologizing anything it can't predict. The real goal wasn't to punish you. It was to make others afraid to think like you. They needed to turn your awakening into a cautionary tale. But awareness can't be outlawed. Once you see, you can't unsee. Once you know, you can't unknow. They can shadow your name, censor your story, or twist your truth, but they can't reverse the download. You carry knowledge that refuses to stay buried. That's what unsettles them. Not your presence, but your perception. You stopped being influenced and started being influential, and they realized too late that the most uncontrollable force on earth is a mind no longer trapped by fear. Your awareness wasn't the problem. It was the proof. Proof that clarity is power. Proof that you can't imprison someone who's already freed their mind. They wanted to punish you for waking up, but all they did was prove how dangerous truth becomes when one person dares to live it out loud. Number 7, they promised your end, because they couldn't predict your return. When powerful people can't understand your origin, they try to control your ending. They promised your downfall not because you were finished, but because they were desperate for closure to a story they couldn't rewrite. They wanted you gone because your existence disrupted their sense of certainty. You became a reminder that some people rise without permission, and that unsettled those who built their power on the illusion of authority. Their mission was never about right or wrong. It was about removal. Erasure was their version of victory. They thought if they took you out of sight, they could take you out of relevance. They assumed your silence would translate into disappearance. But you were never just a body. You were a broadcast. You didn't live from circumstance. You lived from assignment. That's what they missed. They could trace your location, but not your purpose. They could file your name, but never decode your essence. When someone moves through divine timing, human plans become background noise. They wanted to bury you, but your story had resurrection built into its DNA. You didn't rise for revenge. You rose because purpose doesn't expire under pressure. What they called elimination was actually transformation. They thought the ending they scripted would define you, but it only confirmed you. Every trap, every lie, every strategic silence only became proof that you were never walking alone. Their confusion came from trying to apply worldly logic to a spiritual assignment. You were operating from a realm that doesn't need validation or visibility to exist. They didn't realize that the kind of power you carry doesn't need to be seen to be active. It operates in whispers, timing, and divine reversals. So when they promised your end, heaven smiled, because it was already preparing your reintroduction. And now your return isn't revenge, it's revelation. You didn't come back the same, you came back decoded, evolved, and beyond reach. They wanted to delete your presence, but you became their evidence. You are the proof that some stories don't end when they're erased. They restart when they're underestimated. How do you kill what's already transcended jurisdiction? You don't. You just live long enough to watch it rise again. Number 8. You were never a suspect. You were a symbol. They never cared about what you did. They cared about what you represented. You were never the criminal in their story. You were the concept they couldn't contain. Your existence challenged the script. You stood for something too powerful to be reduced to a file number. It wasn't your actions that drew attention. It was the ripple effect of your energy. They saw how people around you started thinking differently, questioning things they were once afraid to question. That's when they realized you weren't just an individual. You were influence. And influence is far more dangerous than any so-called crime. They didn't fear your mistakes. They feared your momentum. One person who sees clearly can awaken 100 who are still blind. That's the threat you posed. Not rebellion, but revelation. You became a walking contradiction to everything they taught people to believe. That power belongs to the system, that truth comes from the top, that silence equals safety. You shattered that illusion simply by existing authentically. So they did what systems always do when a spark appears. They rushed to smother it. They tried to silence you not because of what you said, but because of what your voice could inspire in others. They tried to twist your story, frame your narrative, make you look unstable, extreme, or misunderstood. Anything that would make the crowd step back instead of step forward. Because symbols, when embraced, become movements. And movements don't ask for permission. They create change. But the problem with symbols is that you can't really destroy them. You can erase the person, but you can't erase the meaning. Once people have seen the truth behind the mask, they can't unsee it. You became a mirror that made others question what they were reflecting. You didn't lead a revolution with weapons. You led one with awareness. They labeled you a threat, but what they really meant was teacher. You exposed the weakness in their control, that it only works on those who still believe in it. You were never a suspect in their investigation. You were the evidence that freedom is contagious. And no system, no matter how powerful, can silence the idea whose time has already arrived. Number 9, they didn't want the truth. They wanted a confession. When those in power start to feel their authority slipping, they don't go looking for honesty. They go looking for submission. That's what happened to you. They didn't need the truth. They needed control. They didn't care what really took place, as long as you signed off on their version of events. The goal wasn't justice, it was domination. They wanted you to validate their illusion, to surrender the narrative so they could play creator. Because in their world, truth doesn't have to exist, it just has to obey. They twisted every question, every meeting, every accusation into a performance designed to make you fold. They weren't trying to uncover facts. They were trying to manufacture guilt. They wanted to watch you admit to things you never did, not because they believed it, but because it restored their sense of control. For them, power isn't about evidence, it's about ego. When they can make you confess to their lie, it reinforces their delusion of superiority. but you didn't give them that satisfaction. You refused to co-sign a reality that didn't belong to you. And that's what drove them mad. The quiet strength of your refusal. You didn't shout, you didn't beg, you simply didn't agree. That simple act of resistance exposed how fragile their control really was. They could manipulate paperwork, twist language, or threaten consequences, but they couldn't rewrite your conviction. The irony is that their obsession with your confession revealed their guilt, not yours. Because when the powerful need lies to feel stable, it means the truth has already started eroding their foundation. You stood there as a mirror they couldn't handle, a reflection of how little power they actually had when faced with someone who refused to play along. They wanted to be gods, deciding right and wrong by decree, but your silence dethroned them. You reminded them that authority without integrity is just performance. You didn't need to prove your innocence. Your composure did it for you. The truth they tried to bury became the one thing they couldn't control. Because when truth lives inside you, no amount of pressure, paperwork, or propaganda can force a confession from someone who's already free. Number 10, their promises to your family were psychological warfare. They understood something cruelly simple. If they couldn't reach you through fear, they'd reach you through love. They knew direct attacks wouldn't work because you'd already survived worse. You'd built resilience through pain, discipline, and divine alignment. So instead of trying to destroy you head-on, they went for the people whose opinions could still touch your soul. That's how they waged their quietest, most calculated war. Not through weapons or warrants, but through whispers. They promised your family things that sounded protective, but were poisoned underneath. They told them you'd be gone before court, that it was already decided, and that fighting back would only make it worse. These weren't facts, they were psychological bullets. Lies designed to make your loved ones surrender before a battle even began. Because once they could plant fear inside your family, they could use their panic to break your peace. That's the oldest trick in the book of control. Turn the hearts closest to the target into tools of emotional collapse. They didn't need to lock you up, they just needed your home to feel like a cell. They wanted you to start doubting your purpose because the people who were supposed to believe in you stopped understanding you. That's the real warfare, when your own blood unknowingly carries the enemy's message. They wanted you to feel isolated, unsupported, and misunderstood. They wanted your strength to sound like delusion and your truth to sound like madness. But what they didn't understand is that divine calling doesn't depend on confirmation. You didn't need validation from family to keep walking. You understood something they didn't, that sometimes God separates you from your bloodline to save both you and them. Their confusion wasn't betrayal, it was manipulation disguised as concern. They were caught in a web of fear that wasn't theirs to hold. Empires have always destroyed prophets the same way, not through law, but through loneliness. They knew your strength was spiritual, so they tried to weaken your emotional foundation. Yet every lie they told only pushed you deeper into purpose. You didn't collapse under the silence. You learned how to hear God louder in it. And that was their biggest failure. They turned your family against you, but all they did was push you closer to the one who called you. Number 11, the court date was never about law. It was about timing. They thought they scheduled your downfall, but they were really booking your debut. What they saw as a trial was actually a divine appointment. Heaven doesn't waste chaos. It uses it as a stage. Every accusation, every delay, every document was part of a setup orchestrated by timing, not tragedy. The courtroom was never about verdicts or evidence. It was about exposure. You weren't being tried. You were being revealed. What they meant for humiliation became heaven's press conference. The truth is, divine justice doesn't rush. It waits until everyone who doubted, mocked, or plotted has taken their seats, and then it lets the curtain rise. That's why the case wasn't dismissed early. God let it breathe, not because you were guilty, but because the timing wasn't ripe for revelation. They thought they had power over the outcome, but they were just extras in a scene that had already been written. You weren't standing before men. You were standing before timing itself. They prepared evidence. Heaven prepared witnesses. They rehearsed accusations. Heaven rehearsed redemption. And when the day came, the very environment designed to condemn you became the platform for your vindication. That's why you couldn't avoid it, because it wasn't punishment, it was prophecy. You had to stand there so the truth could be seen, not just known. Sometimes God lets the enemy present their case just to prove how weak it looks in the light. They thought the court would silence you, but it made your voice echo louder. They thought the date would break you, but it branded you instead. Every word spoken against you became another timestamp in heaven's record, evidence that divine timing always wins over human plotting. In the end, what they called judgment became a broadcast of justice. The court wasn't about your downfall, it was about your delivery. They thought they were watching an ending, but God was premiering a revelation. The timing wasn't delayed, it was divine. And when heaven calls for exposure, even your enemies have to sit quietly and watch as truth walks confidently to the witness stand. Number 12. You're not fighting feds, you're fighting the framework. This was never about a government agency or an institution with a name and logo. Those are just the uniforms, the visible faces of something much older, more layered, and more desperate. What you're really up against is the framework, the invisible operating system that controls perception, behavior, and belief. The feds are just the messengers of a dying matrix that's been living off manipulation for generations. When you started questioning what everyone else accepted, you didn't just irritate people in power, you triggered the system itself. The framework doesn't survive on truth, it survives on illusion. It needs people to believe that authority equals morality, that paperwork equals justice, and that fear equals safety. It doesn't care who wears the badge, as long as someone enforces the lie. That's why your awakening caused so much disruption. You didn't just challenge rules, you challenged the subconscious obedience that keeps the machine running. You exposed that the law isn't always lawful, and that order can exist without being just. So when the system pushed back, it wasn't personal. It was mechanical. It reacted the way a glitching computer reacts to a virus, by trying to delete the threat. But you weren't a virus. You were an update. You didn't come to destroy. You came to expose what no longer works. And that's why everything started malfunctioning around you. The illusion couldn't handle being seen. It wore the mask of authority, waving laws and protocols like armor. But underneath it was trembling. Every badge, every headline, every threat was just panic disguised as policy. What you've been fighting is not human. It's habitual. It's the collective addiction to false power. You're dealing with a consciousness that feeds on fear and conformity. That's why it attacks awareness, because awareness starves it. You weren't fighting agents. You were confronting archetypes, fear, deception, control. Once you realized that, their power began to shrink. You're not at war with people. You're disrupting a pattern. You're not being punished for rebellion. You're being tested for readiness. The framework is collapsing, and your presence is proof. You didn't come to fight the feds. You came to unplug the illusion that uses them. And the moment you stopped fearing the structure started fearing you. Number 13. They can read your messages, but not your mission. They've tapped into your calls, traced your routes, mirrored your devices, convinced that the secret lies in what you say or where you go. But they'll never find what drives you, because your purpose doesn't live in data. Your mission isn't something that can be screenshotted, copied, or leaked. It's encrypted in a frequency they were never built to access. They can read your words, but not your wavelength. They can analyze your behavior, but never your becoming. That's the divine joke. They keep searching for what can only be spiritually revealed. They think your life runs on logic, like theirs, so they track patterns, waiting for a predictable move. But your spirit doesn't move by algorithm. It moves by assignment. Every time they think they've mapped your next step, heaven reroutes you. You're not running from them. You're just operating in dimensions they can't monitor. Their software reads everything except obedience to divine timing, and that's where your real strength lives. To them, your silence looks suspicious. To God, it's strategy. They see delays and call them failure. Heaven sees them as calibration. They're confused because they keep looking for evidence of intention in your history, not realizing your direction comes from eternity. They try to document your motives, but there's no language on earth that can translate what's written in your spirit. Every attempt to decode you ends with contradiction because your blueprint wasn't printed on paper. It was breathed into existence. That's why their reports never make sense. One page says you're unpredictable, another says you're strategic. One claims you're a danger, another calls you disciplined. They don't realize both can be true when purpose is involved. They can clone your voice, but they can't replicate your vibration. They can monitor your moves, but not your meaning. You were never meant to be understood by systems built on surface observation. You operate from divine instruction, not human validation. Their confusion is confirmation that your mission is still protected, because the truth is, they can read your messages all they want, but they'll never decrypt the one thing that matters. You were sent, not made, and the source that sent you doesn't leave a paper trail. Number 14. The case they built against you became the proof. God built through you. They collected documents, twisted narratives, and built a case they believed would erase your name. They thought the weight of false evidence would crush your credibility and silence your purpose. But what they didn't realize is that God can turn any file into a testimony. Every lie they wrote became part of a script that heaven already edited. The paperwork they used to bury you didn't become your ending. It became your evidence. What was meant to label you became a ledger of everything you survived. Each accusation, each rumor, each forged detail didn't cancel your destiny. It confirmed it. They thought exposure would destroy you, but it actually validated your assignment. You see, divine justice doesn't erase the attack. It repurposes it. The same system that tried to convict you became the stage for your vindication. The same people who whispered your downfall will one day quote your story as proof that protection doesn't always come through silence. Sometimes it comes through spectacle. What they intended as humiliation became documentation. Every charge against you turned into a chapter of how divine power rewrote human verdicts. Their paperwork couldn't bury you because heaven already copyrighted your existence. You weren't being judged, you were being documented. They were unknowingly writing your testimony in legal ink. And now, when people look back on the records, they won't see guilt. They'll see grace. They'll see a system that tried to end you, and a God who used the evidence to expose corruption itself. When heaven is behind you, even your enemies become unwilling historians of your miracle. They thought they were building a case. They were building a monument. They thought they were writing your downfall. They were publishing your divine immunity. You didn't just survive the setup. You outlived its narrative. The case they built didn't prove your guilt. It revealed your significance. It showed that you were worth orchestrating against because your existence threatened the illusion. And now, every signature, every seal, every fabricated report stands as proof of one thing. God can use bureaucracy as a mirror to show how powerless power really is. The case they wrote to end you became heaven's receipt that you were untouchable all along. Conclusion. In the end, this was never about justice. It was about jurisdiction. Not the kind that exists in courtrooms or government buildings, but the kind that decides who has authority over truth itself. They moved with laws, but you moved with light. They built cases, but you built character. Every investigation, every whisper, every headline was never really about what you did. It was about who you are. They saw someone who couldn't be controlled, and to a system built on control, that's the greatest crime of all. You were never a threat because of your actions. You were a threat because of your awareness. You didn't need a weapon. Your clarity was enough. You didn't need a movement. Your consciousness was the revolution. And every time they tried to trap you in their version of events, heaven rewrote the story from the inside out. That's why their evidence keeps collapsing. They're working with paper, you're working with prophecy. Their goal was exposure, but they didn't realize God already exposed them by letting you survive. The truth is, you were the divine disruption their world wasn't ready for. You weren't sent to destroy the system, you were sent to reveal it. You didn't break it. You just stopped pretending it was whole. The more they studied you, the more they realized they weren't investigating a person. They were confronting a phenomenon. You became living proof that divine intelligence moves in silence, but strikes in season. That's why no matter how closely they watch, they'll never understand the script, because the author never gave them access. The case against you became a mirror for them, showing how fear masquerades as justice and how power hides its insecurity behind procedures. They thought they were writing your downfall, but heaven was using their ink to sign your vindication. What they meant for exposure became expansion. What they meant for elimination became elevation. And now you stand not as a defendant, but as evidence, living proof that divine assignments can't be audited by human systems. They know your name, but not your nature. They've seen your file, but not your fire. They can read your history, but they'll never comprehend your resurrection, because you were never fighting them. You were outliving the framework. If this message resonated with you, if it opened your eyes, stirred your soul, or reminded you that your story isn't over, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to wake up to their own divine immunity. This isn't just content, it's confirmation. Your survival isn't an accident. It's evidence that the system failed and purpose won. Stay blessed always.